Hi, and thank you for joining me for another short lecture. And friends, today I wanted to touch on a topic not discussed or even explained much in everyday Jewish life, and that's regarding the Tallit Katan, or what is plainly called tzitzit. Although tzitzit or tzitziot are technically just the fringes and not the whole beged, at least from a Torah level. But anyways, the Tallit Katan is an article of clothing that religious Jews men usually wear underneath their shirts. Basically a four-cornered garment or undershirt with fringes or tzitzit attached to each of their four corners. That being said, I also will briefly touch on the Tallit Gadol or prayer shawl as well. So to start our friends, you must know that this whole topic of talitot revolves solely around tzitzit, literally the fringes, because this is the actual mitzvah. And the beged or garment that they are attached to, at least from a Torah perspective, are secondary and really only make it as part of the mitzvah, mainly because Chazal or Torah Sheba'al Peh deemed it so. In other words, from a rabbinic halachic perspective, the beged is indistinguishable from the tzitzit in terms of properly fulfilling the mitzvah. So according to halakha, they are one unit. But we'll get back to this later. So friends, in Parashat Shlach, it commands us to put fringes or tzitzit on the corners of our clothing. But at the same time, it fails to explain what actually constitutes tzitzit and where exactly are they put on, and really what even constitutes a garment in the first place. And this, friends, is just another example for the need of a ruling body of judges within the Jewish people to make such decisions. And it seems that even Hashem himself thought so as well, which is why he did not only tell Moshe Rabbeinu to establish a court, but even went as far as to say that by disobeying them, by disobeying this court, they will be disobeying him, Hashem himself. And I must also add that the authority given to this court by the Almighty was only limited to ceremonial issues, such as tzitzit, and areas of how to do Torah, and how Israel could keep Torah in a uniform manner, and not in any way to rewrite Torah or establish the metaphysical, which would then clearly be breaking the command of not adding to the Torah. And that's why, friends, as I do in all my lectures, today I'm going to bring you the actual halacha brought down by Chazal, and pretty much leave out all the fluff that I think corrupts Judaism. For example, people wonder why they can't get a minyan and why people do not want to go pray anymore, when they've added so many additional practices to the early morning service that have nothing to do with halakha. For example, in this topic regarding tzitzit, the Tallit Katan and the Tallit Gadol, there's so many things that do not have to be said. But of course, if you open your average siddur, it makes no distinction between halakha and minhag. For example, you don't have to say Barechi Nafshi or Leshem Yehud or Hareni Mitatef Gufi, or after the actual bracha that you must say of Letatef Betitzit, you don't have to say Mayakar, right? I mean, all this adds at least 5 minutes to your prayer service. 5 minutes of additional suggestions that the modern day Achronim thought could make your experience more meaningful, just ultimately because they thought they knew better. And this, my friends, is what harms Judaism. People thinking they know better and changing the actual halakha or adding to it. Which is why, friends, we encourage you, if you really want to know what the actual halakha and the actual barachot are regarding the prayer service, you're free to download our free siddur at dordea.com. Our Ways of Torah siddur, we have a complete siddur and a complete maksur, including a Pesach Haggadah, to help you fulfill your obligations concisely and halachically. And the reason I must mention this is because many who don't understand either what is oral or rabbinic law sometimes unknowingly dismiss it and then suffer the consequences for doing so. And those consequences, at least on a grand scale, is having a community where everyone interprets ceremonial issues in their own manner, i.e. affecting any form of unity which is necessary if one's goal is for Torah to have a massive social ethical impact. In other words, friends, I don't have to tell you that repairing this world is a team effort because, yes, friends, in this game, quantity is a quality. But anyways, friends, like we said, the mitzvah of tzitzit is directly from the Torah. which is why in the Jewish world you will see religious Jewish men with these tassels proudly peeking out from under their clothing. Now, what seems to be tassels, sometimes coming out of their belt loops, are, like we said, really an undershirt containing tzitzit, or 4 sets of tassels which contain intrinsically tied knots that the Torah tells us to wear so we remember what seems to be the covenant made between us and our Creator. Now, you must also know that although some say that these knots either spell out the name of Hashem or enumerate the Taryag mitzvot, this really depends on what tradition you choose to follow, because the truth is that there are many different ways to tie tzitzit, especially nowadays, right? Like the ones that are typically worn by Ashkenazim are those of the Ravid or even some of the Gra, which are, by the way, almost identical, while Sephardim sport the Ari's tradition, and Yemenites sport what is known as the Rambam's tradition. And there are many, many more styles that don't in any way resemble each other. Now, like we said, the Torah itself did not specify how these fringes are to be worn or even how these fringes are to be tied. As a matter of fact, al pi halacha, all you need is one chuliyah, one knot to properly tie tzitzit. But anyways, like we also said, friends, I really can't stress this enough, that in such a position, or when confronted with such a situation, the people of Israel relied on the ruling body, the Beit Din HaGadol, or what later became known as the Sanhedrin, to codify the practice of at least the basic parameters of tzitzit. So this court decided that because the Torah stated that these fringes should be put on the corners of your garment, and because 4-cornered garments were the garments worn at that time, that the command was given that in order for your garments to require tzitzit, they would have to have at least 4 corners. In other words, the law is that if your garment did not have 4 corners, it did not require tzitzit. Now, I'm not going to go into how you tie them because, like we said, the halakha does not limit them to being tied in any particular manner. Actually, like we said, the law is that all you really need is one huliyah, one knot to constitute tzitzit. And all the different ways you see them tied today are just traditions developed by different communities. But no, none of them are specifically more correct than any other. So, that being said, some are probably wondering, what is the difference between a Tallit Gadol, i.e. the large prayer shawl, and a Tallit Katan, the smaller one, that, like we said, is typically worn by most religious Jews under their shirt. However, there are some who do wear it outside of their shirt, but we'll cover that in a bit. So, what's the difference? Well, apart from one nowadays being larger than the other, nothing really. Well, nowadays some may think that a difference exists because, heck, we even see that even 2 separate brachot exist, right? Al mitzvat tzitzit for a talit katan and letatef betitzit for a talit gadol. Well, you would probably be surprised to know that no such bracha exists amongst Chazal of al mitzvat tzitzit. In other words, that is a much later unauthorized addition to our oral law that someone decided to invent and include along the set of brachot brought down by the court. And yes, adding to the oral or rabbinic law still violates the isur of adding to the Torah. So by employing these 2 different brachot, it gave people the idea that there are 2 different mitzvot being employed here. One for the mitzvah, or really just minhag of atifa, of wrapping or enshrouding ourselves, in this case, with a beged or garment that has tzitzit, also known nowadays, like we said, as the talit gadol. And next, for the talit katan, which is said by single men, at least in the Ashkenazi world, who have the practice of not wearing a talit gadol till they get married, when they would then stop saying al mitzvat tzitzit altogether, and then only say letatef batitzit, although they never stopped wearing a talit katan as well. Something else that may give one the idea that there's some sort of distinction between a talit katan and a talit gadol is the modern day practice of not saying shechianu on a new talit katan and saying shechianu for a talit gadol. And friends, I think this really lays down the premise for what I will discuss with you today on what was the actual purpose of a talit katan and who invented it and why was it invented. First, you must understand that both expressions of talitot, whether it's katan or gedolah, were both invented to accommodate the same idea. Again, what do I mean? That they are just 2 opportunities to illustrate the mitzvah of tzitzit. But the truth is that because modern day clothing does not typically have four corners, that at least according to halakha, neither of these two unpractical additions are ever required to be worn. In other words, you do not need to or are ever required to wear either of these two garments nowadays. And you're probably thinking, Rabbi Asher, you're right about the Tallit Katan, but this is not true about the Tallit Gadol. And no, friends, I mean both. But regardless, nowadays the Tallit Gadol is almost inseparable from Jewish life, when, like we said, that halachically it's not a law that it ever even has to be donned. As a matter of fact, the main reason the Tallit Gadol, or the unpractical garment, mentioned by Tosfos in Pesachim, Kuf Yud Gimel Amid Bet, and even the Rambam in Hilchot Tzitzit Perek Gimel Halacha Yud Aleph, as a good idea, came into existence, really was because of a midrash, a rabbinic legend, in Masechet Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Zayin Amud Bet, where it states that Hashem himself enshrouded himself in Tzitzit while teaching Moshe Rabbeinu the order of the prayers. In other words, friends, because of Agadah, something you don't have to believe, something that's actually disposable. Now, I'm sure the Medrash was referring to Hashem's regular clothing that required tzitzit and not a separate beged. I mean, chas v'halila, that we should ever speak of Hashem of having any corporeal qualities. Remember this the next time you see Jews claiming that no one ever taught the idea of Hashem having a body or a shape or chas v'shalom even clothing. In other words, friends, it's a nice picture, but totally optional to believe. And because of this legend, the sages themselves began the practice of ituf, or atifa, of enshrouding themselves in a similar fashion. Now, in some cases, it was adopted into halakha. For example, the halakha is that the members of the Sanhedrin must always be wrapped in such a beged. Now, I'm not really going to touch on what atifa really encompasses, because this is an area of much dispute. Actually, the practice is known as atifa Ishmaelim, literally an Arab-style wrap, which seems at one time was part of every male garment and even encompassed other brachot like Oter Yisrael B'Tifara, which mistakenly does not refer to tefillin, but to what Arabs call today an agal, which they then put on top of their kafiyas, which, by the way, I might also add, have tzitzit. In other words, the original beged worn by Israel was placed on one's head and held in place by an agal, and it extended down to below the knees. But friends, this is really for another video. But again, like we said, in short, because we do not regularly wear four-cornered garments as everyday dress, people are not required to wear tzitzit anymore. Now, can you wear something you're not required to or have no need in wearing, which is the idea for the Tallit Katan in the first place? Or like we see many in, let's say, the Messianic world who wear tzitzit on their belt loops, which is clearly a personal understanding of Bamidbar 15. And yes, these technically are tzitzit, at least from a literal Torah sense. And although the practice of wearing tzitzit through your belt loops is not in any way according to halakha, I think it's really a beautiful illustration of the command of tzitzit, which one is not required to wear, but it's a nice way of using them as physical reminders of Torah. However, I think they would be better off adopting the Tallit Katan, which although has also been greatly debated if creating a smaller garment that happens to have four corners for the sole purpose of placing tzitzit on it, at least nowadays when it's really not, at least in any practical way, part of everyday dress, if this should even be considered as fulfilling anything halachically. Anyways, look, I think it would just look better. Now, there are some that do meet this requirement: length, fabric, need, shape. But even to these, it would be hard to say that the person didn't go out of his way to develop such a garment. Unless, I guess, if you're wearing a poncho or a kapata, which, by the way, Lubavitchers actually round off one of the corners so as not to be chayiv in the mitzvah of tzitzit. But regardless, it has become the custom. Also, in case you're wondering what fabric the actual Tallit Katan should be made of, the halacha is that only wool and linen garments require tzitzit from a Torah level, and the rest only from a rabbinic level, with the exception of leather garments. In other words, leather garments do not require tzitzit at all. So we see here that the Shulchan Aruch is holding like Chazal, and the Ramah paskins the other way. Anyways, long story short, no matter how you hold, all your four-cornered garments require tzitzit. Again, with the exception of your leather garments. Actually, to go back to what we were previously talking about, it's a little bit funny how some Jews actually go as far as to make fun of others who wear tzitzit through their belt loops, and at the same time believe that not just do they not care to teach them the correct manner to wear them, but sometimes go as far as to teach that they are forbidden to do so. Now, the notion of creating a scenario in which you would have a beged that required tzitzit when initially you did not need one, like we said, is found all the way back in Tosfos and even the Rambam. However, the idea they were relating to has nothing to do with what we call a Tallit Katan today. As a matter of fact, this, or their words, was the justification and birth of the Tallit Gadol. Remember, in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, or even Rabbi Akiva, people didn't walk around with a talis bag. In other words, what we call a talis or a talit was part of their clothing. And what Tosfos and the Rambam bring down is the idea of creating a garment that required tzitzit when one's clothing did not require tzitzit, which is why no new size requirement were ever given for the talit katan, at least not by Rishonim. In other words, the requirements for any garment requiring tzitzit, at least for tzitzit that could be used for atifah, the practice of wrapping yourself in tzitzit, was always the same. Call it a talit katan or gadol, which is, al pi halakha, a garment large enough for a child who is old enough to traverse a marketplace alone to completely wrap his whole body with. In other words, the Rambam states clearly to what became known as a talit gadol or gedolah, or the wrapping of oneself in such a garment, that this was an admirable act as performed by the students of the sages when they did not have a four-cornered garment. In other words, to take a garment that had four corners and wrap themselves in it as to fulfill the glorious notion of atifah. And this gave birth to the prayer shawl. Now, you must know that this notion of a talit gadolah, or just talit, was part of their everyday clothing. In other words, something they incorporated into their everyday clothing. Something, might I add, that's a little hard to do if the garment is being worn under the clothing like they do today, like some lucky charm, to the point that they were even known for using them to carry bundles on their back, similar to what Jewish men wore in Yemen, the garment known as the shamlah, and not to what a talis has become nowadays. No, friends, the talit gadol has taken on a solely religious status used by individuals during ceremonial worship. In other words, a talit or a talit gadol became something that only religious Jewish men wore during prayer, and the average Jew who was not religious did not. So just like anything that was used in everyday life, in not just biblical times, but with worldwide Jewry prior to the 14th century, these objects only began to be seen in places of worship and not in everyday Jewish life, which is why it then became deified as something regulated to either the synagogue or times of prayer and not Jewish life as a whole. And friends, if you don't believe me, just try to walk into a bathroom with your talit in front of another religious Jew and watch if he doesn't yell at you for a practice that according to halakha is perfectly permitted. Or try to throw out tzitzit in a regular trash can and not a genizah, and watch if anyone fails to correct you, something else that is allowed. In other words, friends, halachically and hashkafically, there wasn't ever a separation between chol, i.e. the mundane, and what people call Yahadut or Judaism or religious Jewish life. Because as a Jew, friends, every aspect of our day was on that precious derech, on the ways of Torah, which is why tzitzit was something that was worn all day, and tefillin were also worn all day. I mean, it's a little primitive for someone to believe that God only sees you while you're at shul, which is the attitude that is taken when we choose to sanctify Jewish life behind certain walls, instead of acknowledging every day and every second of your life as part of your Torah walk. Which is, if you think about it, why the talit katan was invented in the first place, to take something that would not have been applicable and make it applicable. In other words, to bring a mitzvah that is in many ways outdated into daily life, which probably makes you wonder, if this was the case, why is the talit katan worn under the clothing? Which has been actually the way that in the last 300 years, at least 300 years, that the Sephardim and Ashkenazim wore their tzitzit. Now you're probably thinking, Rabbi Asher, most Orthodox individuals that I know have the custom of wearing their beged under their shirt and letting their tzitziot hang out from the bottom. And you would probably be surprised to hear that the custom of wearing tzitzit from under your shirt did not become the norm in Orthodoxy till very, very recent. I would say even the last 40 years. Even Rav Moshe Feinstein would instruct against it. For example, in the 60s in Chaim Berlin, in Brisk, in Torah Vodaas, YU, Nir Yisrael, and even Chafetz Chaim, you would never see any of their Talmidim wear tzitzit in such a manner. In other words, in this area, they poskin like the Ari, who stated that not only the beged, but the tzitzit themselves must be worn underneath the clothing. So in older days, only Chabad Hasidim wore their tzitzit in such a manner, which was a custom really initiated by the Shulchan Aruch Harav, built, as it seems, off the words of the Magen Avram, as a compromise between the Pasak of the Shulchan Aruch, which ruled that one should always wear a Tallit Katan completely outside one's clothing. In other words, the beged and the tzitzit. And then the Pasak of the Ari, who stated that they both, the beged and the tzitzit, should be worn underneath. And it's actually interesting how customs suddenly change, in, at least historically speaking, in a blink of an eye, when everyone assumes that that said custom felt like it probably dated back to Moshe Rabbeinu himself. Actually, there's even a machloket if one could wear Tallit Katan on Shabbat without an eruv, being that it's technically not a regular garment, which is why Rav Kapach or Rav Kafe, and even those from Brisk, taught that one is not allowed to wear one on Shabbat, a Tallit Katan. Actually, it is interesting that non-Chabad Hasidim actually follow the Shulchan Aruch's Pasach on wearing the Tallit Katan completely over their clothing, and even strive to wear an extra long one to at least try to fulfill the proper length requirement. So, friends, it's pretty safe to say that it was the Arizal, who invented the Tallit Katan as we know it today, i.e. the small Tallit that is worn under one's clothing, as he states, that apart from the regular Tallit that was for one's body, that the Tallit Katan, the one he commanded to wear, should be worn under one's clothing, to be the Tallit for your soul. Interesting, huh? So friends, to briefly recap, the Tallit itself, what is known today as a Tallit Gadol or prayer shawl, this was the innovation of the smaller unrequired beged mentioned by Tosfos and the Rambam. And the creation of the Tallit Katan was really by taking this beged and making it into a smaller one. And in terms of the way it's worn nowadays as a Tallit under the clothing with the titiot sticking out from under the shirt, this was instituted by the Arizal. I mean, actually, the Arizal's Pasak is that even the titiot should be under the clothing. But because of this Pasak, we see the Magen Avraham and even the Shulchan Aruch Harav pass from this way as a compromise. Because remember, at the time of the Ari in Tzvat, people weren't wearing pants like they were in Europe. So the possibility of sticking your tzitzit from underneath your shirt did not exist. And friends, another point I'm trying to solidify with this video is the fact that a Tallit Katan and a Tallit Gadol are ultimately, or at least were meant initially, to ultimately be the same thing. In other words, in a halakha, there aren't halachot regarding both of them. I mean, perhaps I know that nowadays they are, but this is only really according to Achronim. And certainly not Chazal. And who are Chazal? Predominantly Tanaim and Amoraim. Because, like we said, that the notion of the Tallit Katan did not exist. Just as according to Torah Sheba'al Peh, the idea of a Tallit Gadol never existed either, but was only later thought of as a way to practice a mitzvah that was dependent on the instance that one's garment contained four corners. So regarding tzitzit, one should not assume in this day and age that someone is not a religious Jew because he chooses not to wear one, either a Tallit Gadol or a Tallit Katan. And also, one thing you probably didn't know, that at least according to the Rambam, you could actually have different color tzitzit if the beged itself was that color. I mean, red tzitzit, green tzitzit. But again, this is just according to the Rambam. And till today, I've never seen anyone try this. And regarding women wearing a Tallit Katan or a Tallit Gadol, because these fall under the category of mitzvah taseh shechazman grama, i.e. commandments that are time-bound, which women are exempt from, they are not obligated in this mitzvah in any circumstance. However, can they wear one if they wanted to without the obligation? Well, because they are not obligated and the garment of tzitzit, whether the large or small one, has come to be known as a male's garment, then the answer would be no. Under the Torah's prohibition of a woman donning beged ish, a male's garment. But if it was one made specifically for women, then there really wouldn't be an issue. So friends, for more information on everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.org. Thank you.